I'm Stephanie Filardi. Welcome to Mind the Gap, the podcast. I believe many people fall short of living the life of their dreams simply because they get stuck in what I call the gap. The vision behind this podcast is to help you understand how to navigate the gap and in the process, awaken to the life that is waiting for you. It starts now. Let's go. Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining us today on this podcast episode. And I'm excited to share with you that I have another guest, Ryan Ostheimer, and we are going to be speaking about what's happening today, how it relates to consciousness, and some other interesting topics to give you some tools and inspiration to navigate this time. So we'll start by taking 3 conscious breaths. So let's begin. Inhaling, filling belly, ribs, and chest. Exhale, slow release, let it go out of your mouth, chest, ribs, and belly. Again, inhaling, filling belly, ribs, and chest. Exhale, slow, sweet release as you let it go, chest, ribs, and belly. And then one more time, big breath in, filling belly, ribs, chest. Exhale, sweet surrender as you let it go, chest, ribs, and belly. And noticing the effects of that breath. We only took 3 conscious breaths, but a reminder during these times that it's important to stop and to breathe. It's really the portal to the inner world and to the possibility of peace. And with that, I'd like to introduce Ryan Ostheimer, who's here with us today. I'm going to just go right for it, Ryan, and ask you to introduce yourself, tell the listeners who you are, what you want them to know, and anything else that you're aware of at this moment.
Alrighty. Well, thank you for having me. Yes, my name's Ryan, and my main practice is in studying and practicing enlightenment, the end of suffering. So, really the summarizing of it is just constantly paying attention to how we're feeling, to how I'm feeling, and if there's any suffering that arises, then I acknowledge it and learn from it, work through it. And the more I've done that, the more I've started to move beyond these various obstacles and learned more in the practice and become more resilient. So that's what I do, and that's also what I teach through my coaching, spiritual life coaching. It's kind of the label that I've came across. I don't know if I prefer not to even have a label, but you kind of have to have one, you know. So I just go with that label for now. But so I like working one-on-one with individuals, and I make lots of videos and been part of a lot of podcasts lately, actually. So I'm enjoying this.
Excellent. Well, I have to say right off the bat that I, first of all, acknowledge you for, saying yes and for showing up and for being in service, and that your energy is so beautiful and calm.
Thank you.
So I feel that, I appreciate that, and I look forward to the unfolding of this podcast because I suspect that the listeners will not only gain intellectual wisdom perhaps and spiritual nourishment, but they'll feel the transmission of your peaceful, energetic, high vibration.
Thank you. That's actually one of the big things that I've been sitting with lately is noticing the difference between the intellectual understandings of all of this and the spiritual, the beautiful spiritual concepts and philosophies. But then the other part of that equation is the integration of how much do we actually feel the truth that we believe in, and then how much of it is shaken up when we experience various life challenges, including, this big global one.
I love that. Yes. And I've often said, like, this time that we're in right now as we deal with this coronavirus and pandemic. And again, I'm hesitant to even use the words and the labels, but yet, the understanding that so many of us, I feel like, have this wisdom inside of us and teach it, right? Or have read about it. And some of us, it's innate in our being. And now is the time to really embody it and practice it. So what you just said about your kind of exploration of like this intellectual, and then how am I feeling in my body? And I'd love for you to share a little bit more, if you will, Ryan, about, at the start you had said that, you study and you teach about enlightenment and the end of suffering. And I would like to maybe use this as an opportunity. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about the ways that we as humans experience suffering? Because that's a big word. And I feel like sometimes people think, oh, well, I'm sad, that's not suffering, or something. Like, I think there needs to be a little bit more of a understanding of what that means. So would you mind speaking to that?
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. For me, in the beginning as well, I had that sort of the similar belief that suffering was really a word that only belonged to like the super intense stuff, the 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 immense pains that we may experience when we experience a big life challenge, or the real loud stuff like the anger, or I don't know, just the really heavy things. But as the Buddha referred to suffering when he mentioned the end of suffering, there's also the very subtle levels of suffering. Just the slight feeling of angst or anxiety or nervousness. Um, so it can range. It can range from immense fear and pain to just slight feelings of irritation or impatience, which I've found that, in studying enlightenment is you kind of focus on the big ones first, the ones that are really pulling out a lot of our energy, or draining us of a lot of our energy. But then the practice very much becomes a little, more advanced in the sense that you start to fine tune the little stuff, the little sneaky feelings of impatience when you're sitting at a red light, or the feeling of irritation when somebody does something that you don't quite agree with, or shares an opinion that you don't quite resonate with. Is there any slight feeling of being put off? So, another way to look at it in a more universal way is simply looking at it as positive or negative. Um, Positive being, the peace and I get love or compassion and understanding and forgiveness, all those wonderful things, joy. And the negative just being anything that disturbs the peace, whether it be something big or something small, and to really just, I think a big part that's important in all of this is recognizing that whenever there is suffering, whenever there is, because another word for suffering would also be ego. Whenever we experience any form of disruption to our peace, it means some part of ego is operating in us. And, it's, at first it can be challenging to be willing to admit, but it's only challenging if we believe that all of this is personal. When you start to recognize that, whether it be something intense like anger and, intense fear, or something subtle like impatience and or nervousness, then, often we're also not really willing to admit it to somebody else, or even to ourselves. We're not really willing to admit when we're experiencing those various bits of discomfort, because fundamentally we have this idea that somehow it represents us. That if we have some kind of a fault, so to speak, that it represents who we are, and that's actually not true, because who we are goes way beyond our suffering. And that's also part of how enlightenment works, is realizing more and more who we are by also realizing more and more of who we are not. So
Mm.
there's no reason to be embarrassed or to be hesitant about admitting where we have our faults, so to speak, or our sufferings, because it doesn't represent us just as much as when we are, another part of the big practice is how do you when you do find the peace, how do you interact with people that are operating an ego, right? Operating on consciousness. And a big piece of that puzzle is really just recognizing that their ego does not really represent who they are. It's just their conditioning. And be able to sincerely look through their ego, to not attach it to who they are, is really the way that we can interact with somebody that's maybe attacking us in some mental way, yet it doesn't feel personal. It doesn't feel heavy. It doesn't create reactivity within us. It doesn't spark our own suffering because we look through it and we don't take it seriously, in a sense. But that's all very much practice.
So you're saying, thank you. You're so enriching, everything you're saying. So I wanted to have a moment and speak to some of these terms that, again, some of the listeners might not be as familiar with. I know that they listen to this podcast, and I have talked about suffering, and I have talked about beliefs and an ego and etc. So I'd like to share a little bit, or have you share a little bit about, like, one of the things, and that's quite frankly the title of this podcast, is really Mind the Gap. And the gap, as I define it and have experienced it, is the place in our life where we're in between, and very much so this place right now when we feel like we're in breakdown, because it feels like there's so much of our ego and our survival context is being threatened, right? And you touched on all of this so beautifully. So I define the gap as, and the suffering that comes from being in the gap is greater when we have more resistance to where we are. So like if I'm in resistance to where I am, if I'm not accepting where I am because I want to be somewhere else, there's a gap. So there's a gap from where I am today. And in my mind says, well, if you're over here, you'll be happy. Or when you're over here, you'll, whatever the words are, be successful. So there's a gap. And I feel like the greater that gap is between where we are and where we want to be, the greater the suffering. And in many cases, what you talk about the ego and how we have these conditioned ways of being, and even with people that maybe feel badly about feeling a certain way, I think it's important to help the listeners understand that there's a difference between suffering and pain. There's no question that right now there's a lot of pain being experienced by people, whether it's the loss of a loved one, the loss of a job. There's a lot of pain, and yet we sometimes perpetuate our suffering because of that resistance to where we are. So can you speak a little bit to that, if you don't mind?
Oh yeah, there's a lot in there. The first part being that, I think it's really important that we that we question our definitions of any word, and keep an open mind to be able to keep the definitions malleable in a sense, or flexible. Because when we have a certain idea of what any word means, especially the more spiritual ones, if it's not flexible, then anything that disagrees or that challenges that definition will be experienced in a sort of defensive way, which is also very much how the ego works, ironically. So you can make a whole spiritual practice just on continuing to deepen definitions of various words, whether it be enlightenment or ego or presence, being, consciousness. I mean, that in and of itself is an incredible practice.
Well said. So what do you think it is about? So for those of us who maybe haven't studied as much as you or I on this path, what is it that when it comes to the ego, why does the ego want to hold on so tight? Like, why is it so, what is that about as humans that it wants to just hold on for dear life so much so? And I've experienced this in my own life, in my private, romantic relationships, where sometimes my ego is so at play and wants to be right that I will literally destroy by my behavior the exact thing I'm trying to create. So can you talk a little bit about, like, for people on a daily basis, and in particular in context of what's happening now, why does the ego feel so threatened that it needs to hold on? What's that about?
Yeah, the word ego is a deep one. There are a lot of layers, there are a lot of angles, a lot of definitions within that word. So a lot of it does depend on the context of where you're trying to study from the word ego. In this one, one of the definitions of ego is that it has to do, it's constantly identified with the surface of reality, with the forms in our world, with relationships, with everything that has to do with um, the physical reality that we see and that we touch and that we smell and taste and all of that. And it also has to do with our, I guess you could say, mental worlds, our interpretations of this world that are based on our mental conditions and patterns and belief structures and all of that. Um, so whenever all of that is all subject to impermanence. Anything in the physical reality that we are in right now is subject to death, basically, to the ending, which can be really scary if you identified with the impermanence. Then suddenly you're constantly in survival mode because the very nature of what you're identified with is impermanent. Whereas a big part of enlightenment is that realization of the fact that who you are on the deepest level is not subject to impermanence. And the more you truly know this, the less you experience various forms of suffering that occur from that fundamental belief that anything that is real can be threatened. That who you are in the deepest levels can in any way experience something that threatens who you are. Um, so like, as far as let's maybe, it might be easier to focus on one example. So what would be, you mentioned
Mhm. Yes.
relationships, I believe.
I was getting to that. Yeah. So we can use relationship, or in this context of what's happening, from a financial perspective, I know that a lot of people are experiencing financial crisis right now. Either their business closed, they're not earning income, or so I feel like that might be a good example. Like if you're a person who's in this situation right now, where you're feeling the loss, the financial loss, whether it's real or imagined. Um, do you want to use that as the example in terms of like how to
Yeah, sure.
talk through what the ego thinks versus who we are? And that would be
Uh-huh.
awesome. Hmm.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Um, all right. So yeah, let's say suddenly, you're hit with this reality of the fact that your business closes, and so you don't have this source of income coming in that you're depending on, in the physical sense of the world, right? I mean, understandably, practically, in the practical sense, we have to bring in money in order to survive, so to speak. Um, but where the ego, can really sneak in, it can sneak in a lot of different ways. Part of which is the fact that the ego is very uncomfortable with not knowing. Any circumstance where we're put into a situation where we really do not know what's going to happen in the future, and we're left in this state of uncertainty, um, then we experience suffering if there is any ego within us, with any misidentification within us. Um, Whereas when you know who you are, and you know who you are in relation to life, which includes this particular situation of the money, running dry or whatnot, um, then then there's trust. There's a deep, sincere level of trust that whatever is happening is supposed to be happening. That nothing is ever really out of place, and a trust that life is constantly giving us what we need in order to evolve in order to deepen ourselves, in order to get closer and closer to our own truth. And this type of example is actually, you can see it in a sense of why it is actually valuable, because let's say, you're running out of money, so you start to experience all this fear. Well, the fear is a representation of the lack of actual trust, a trust in a higher power, or a trust in something divine, a trust that life in and of itself is is constantly giving you life challenges to deepen learning who you are and who you are not. And for example, with that one, it would certainly be really developing a deeper and deeper trust in being comfortable, just not knowing what's going to happen next, not knowing where your income's going to come in next, or if the government's going to help, or if this person's going to do that, or how long is this going to last? How do I plan for all of this? But the ego, being in that it does not trust. It feels there's a deep desire for control that the ego also has. In the feeling of not trusting life, it feels that I have to be in control. I have to think about this and plan everything and figure it all out. Otherwise, it's all going to go crumbling, and it's going to be a giant mess. And the irony of that is that you have to pay attention to how you're feeling when you're wanting to find solutions. Because if you're operating instead of fear, instead of panic, then I know for myself that when I experience fear and anxiety, I can't think straight. I can't actually find effective solutions to problems. It's almost like the very negative energy that I'm experiencing almost creates more problems and more problems. Whereas if I could see this as a spiritual lesson and surrender, then, many times, that's like where miracles occur. When you deeply surrender and you trust life, and suddenly a miracle will come across, and the very thing you feared will be, as far as what you won't have, will suddenly be given to you in ways that you were not expecting. Because at that moment, you learned the real lesson and why it was occurring. And so you're given the reward, so to speak, of what you were worried about in the first place.
Yes. So thank you. Everything that you're saying, it's actually moving exactly where I was hoping and intending it to move, in terms of, it's almost like what you're saying reminds me of like looking at this situation that's happening right now in the world. Collectively, we're all experiencing it, and we get to practice how we want to view it. So if we view it from the lens of ego, let's say, then there will be a lot of fear and anxiety and that want to control, because the ego doesn't like the unknown. And like you said, when we operate from that place, that fear place, I think of it as like this contraction and this tightness, either in my belly or in my chest. And it's the place where we're in resistance to life. We're in resistance to what is. And what you're bringing in so beautifully is this reminder that we have a choice to look at what's going on through the view of enlightenment, which is really, just to kind of land it a little bit, is the view of coming from a place of faith and trust, and the spiritual maybe lens, if you will, that this is happening for us, whether it's happening for us to awaken, whether it's happening for us to build our relationships stronger, or whatever. There's many reasons why, right? That if we can take the tools, there are so many tools in these wisdom traditions, and actually apply them and study them, that there is a possibility to feel a sense of peace and faith no matter what is going around us in the physical world. Because I can share like a personal example. I have a physical business, and when this started happening, we started to feel the financial impact clearly, very quickly. In less than 3 days, I saw our business go from thriving to virtually nothing. And we were not prepared for that. And when I hit a day where I was in such a fear stress mode, which I have not been, if ever, maybe in a very long time. And it was really eye-opening, because it made me really question, like, okay, if this is what I'm teaching and these are really the practices, what am I not seeing? And what I saw, Ryan, was that this is actually a tremendous opportunity, because I had been wanting to build a virtual business.
Uh-huh.
Now, I didn't envision that it was going to happen this way. Very basically I got, when I stopped resisting, and this is the point I'm trying to make, is that when I stopped resisting what was happening, when I was able to see where my ego was showing up in fear and control and all those things, I was contracted and I didn't see the other possibilities. When I was able to relax and to accept and to really deepen into this work and surrender, all of a sudden it was like I moved into a place of gratitude, humility, and peace. And I said, Stephanie, this is the exact thing you've been wanting to do.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, so powerful. Like, I'm so happy you shared that, because I really want us to be able to give the listeners tools right now to be able to navigate whatever they're facing, whether it's a financial situation, a health situation, a relationship situation, all of it, that when we can learn the ways of being that help us connect to the view of enlightenment, which I know is a big word, awareness, consciousness, that we can actually receive what's here for us to receive. So thank you for laying it out that way, because I want to be able to give people the tangible tools to understand that they're not alone, that it's normal and human to feel, because we are in the physical body and we do have to eat and have shelter and all those things. And yet there is this whole other dimension of spirituality and consciousness that when we're able to access it and then start to live in that in such a way, then we start to see the world in a different way. And as we're kind of moving towards the end of this podcast, I would love for you had said something to me when we were communicating about setting up this podcast, about how our state of consciousness, how it affects our external experience. So I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind speaking a little bit about, like, what does that mean? What is your definition of consciousness, first of all? And then what do you mean when you say our state of consciousness? What is that? And then how does that connect to what we're experiencing in the outer world? I think that would be immensely helpful to round out the conversation and also to give people the tools to navigate right now.
Yeah, that's a powerful pointer, and it can be humbling, actually, this topic, because what it does is it switches our perspective to taking full responsibility for what we're experiencing. And so if you're experiencing a lot of problems, it can be a hard pill to swallow, to admit, like, hold on, am I really the source of all these problems? Am I really attracting all of these things? That can be uncomfortable, because for so long the ego anyway tends to make itself into this victim state of, oh, I'm just a victim of circumstance and of crazy people and of problems after problem. But it's never my fault. It's always everybody else. So switching that perspective to taking full responsibility for our external world can be very challenging. And that's okay if you do feel challenged by it. Just sit with that, observe that. Because the beauty, if you are willing to accept the challenge, is that if you can experience that humble taking of responsibility, then you also step into the power of being able to actually change your reality and your experience of it, which is tremendously beautiful. And in my own experience, I've it's just amazing how many times a challenge has presented itself, and I focused on my state of consciousness, meaning how I was feeling in that moment, and whether it was positive or negative, whether there was resistance, which is, like you said, a contraction, and a suffering. Resistance is another word for suffering, whether it be big or small. And so whenever there's any suffering, then that state of consciousness was operating in me. And so my primary purpose is to not fix what's happening on the outside, but first fix what's happening on the inside, the resistance, and find perspectives and use the tools to release that, to then, I guess you could say, increase the frequency, or a less ethereal way of putting it is like just returning to your peace. And then from that state of peace, suddenly things actually do change on the outside of reality when you change your state of consciousness. It's amazing, but it is really the portal of miracles, where you'll just suddenly, you have a resistance to something, and then you catch that, you deal with that, and then suddenly the solution will appear, or the right person will just come across, will just come up, onto your path to be of service to you. And it's quite amazing, and it really hints at the truth that everything is way more connected than we realize, including um, who you are and what you're experiencing in the physical reality. It's something that might seem kind of a stretch, but at the same time, there is actually a strong correlation between what we experience in our external world and what's going on internally. And as far as connecting those dots too, it's also about, again, trusting that life is giving us whatever we need to continue to evolve and to continue to deepen, to continue to get closer to who we are. And ironically, who we are at our core is life. We are life. And so it's like the deeper part of us knows exactly what challenges we need to get closer to the deeper part of us. And so that's why we attract various challenges, to shake that stuff up and to learn from it and to transcend these various bits of ego. And then that naturally brings us closer to our source. And then the first question, the definition of consciousness. Yeah, consciousness is a big word, and it may be unfamiliar, but it, what's a good way to put it? Awareness, as I've heard you mention in your podcast, awareness is a good word for it. But it also, self, the true self, the divine self, is very much involved in that word consciousness. Another way of putting it too is consciousness represents all the fruits of the beautiful things that various religions point at, love and compassion and forgiveness and kindness and just all the good stuff, whereas unconsciousness sort of represents the darkness, the greed, the selfishness, the fear, the anger, the reactivity. Um, so that's kind of another little pointer to put into with the word consciousness. Some people use the word consciousness to replace the word God, just because the word God for them doesn't quite feel right. So they prefer the word consciousness. Yeah, it's a very, very complex word. And, again, really just, you can make a whole spiritual practice just out of definitions of words and exploring different perspectives and hearing, you start with one definition and then you explore one that's the exact opposite, and then trust your discernment in deciding what feels right and continuing to do that and continuing to deepen your understandings of the various words that at first seem very unfamiliar. But, and then in that process, they become more familiar. And it's not just intellectually understanding these things, but directly experiencing all the beautiful wisdom, is where it becomes so life-changing. And that's also, why these various challenges can be such gifts, because they really give us an honest and often humbling reality check as to like if you say you believe in God, yet there is fear of death, then there's a reality check there, because when you really know of an infinite being and that you are divinely connected to it, then the concept of death it doesn't really have any weight. It doesn't have any, there's no negativity at all in it. Even if a friend or a family member were to pass, when you know who you are and who they are, and how that's all connected to the divine, then there's nothing negative in death. There's no reason to suffer in it. But if you do, then that's okay. That's where you honor it and you use it to deepen, uh, your practice and your understanding and your path. And that's how it
Wow.
is. And the last thing I'd want to throw in there is just that, it's interesting. This global one is really kind of putting everybody in check, so to speak. But at the same time, life challenges are nothing new to any of us. Throughout our whole lives, we've been experiencing tons of life challenges. Probably some that are even bigger than this one. way bigger or more feeling more personal or difficult than this particular one. So, it's actually that we've been offering this practice an opportunity to deepen our whole lives, but we just haven't quite noticed it or realized it. And the same will be said for when this particular, virus one passes. Eventually it will pass and we'll go back to normal life. Then it's a question of, did you go deep enough within this one to remember it when you experience other ones, when you experience smaller ones or even bigger ones? Can you, in those moments, use that to really find if there's a juxtaposition between what you believe and what you are truly experiencing in your emotions? Because the emotions tell you what you really believe.
Beautiful. There is a lot of amazing, powerful gems in what you were just speaking about. And I'm going to do my best respectfully to summarize three that I feel that are kind of in listening to you, the three kind of key points to summarize this as we close. And the first thing, I love that you said that the challenges, the things that are happening to us, that we attract the challenges to grow. It brings us closer to our source and being able to take full responsibility. Yes, while it might be a hard pill to swallow, as you so compassionately said, I believe that it is the opportunity for growth. And in studying, I've studied yoga and the Bhagavad Gita, and one of the phrases that always sticks with me is that nothing is wasted. So if we, to your point, look at this time as an opportunity to grow and to look at what was lurking beneath the surface that's now being put in front of our face, that we will endure and we will be stronger and we will gain the tools to navigate life. Because like you said, all of us have experienced challenge. And what's amazing is that the second point is that you said the word direct experience. And I love that, because when we started the podcast, we were saying that, there's one thing about having intellectual information and reading the books and all of it, and even listening to this podcast, right? It's awesome. It's intellectual information. It's wisdom. And yet, unless and until we have a felt sense of it, until we have a direct experience of it, which we are collectively having now, there's not a real strong motivation to change and to do anything about it. And I think because we are experiencing this at the level of the collective, it's almost like we don't have a choice, right? We have to find the ways to navigate and which is my third point, which is kind of what I was, hoping we would get to, which is, I say it is what we see is what we get. Meaning, to your point, what's happening on the inner world is being reflected in the outer world. And the way I'm going to share that is, like, if we want peace in our life, then we get to choose to be peaceful within, right? So I always say it always starts within. If we want love, then we be love. And it's as simple and as complicated as that, right? We know what happens with ego, right? The ego likes to kind of jump in there and distract us from that task. But if we can remember that all of this is happening for us to awaken, for us to learn and grow, and that now is the time to be in the experience and to not waste our time, to really understand and try to figure out what's here for me to learn? How can I grow? And then recognizing that if we believe and we want to be peaceful inside, and we do feel peaceful inside because we've done the inner work, that we see peace outside. And I remember years ago when I went through my shamanic training, one of my teachers said, you either believe you live in a benevolent, kind world or not. And I happen to believe that we live in a benevolent world, a kind world. So when I see evil, the way I understand it, quotes evil, is that forgive them for they know not what they do. So I just wanted to share those pointers because I feel like everything that you have been offering so far on this podcast has been so enriching to me personally, and I know will be to our listeners. And I want them to be able to take it in, to experience it, to feel it, to chew it, to digest it, and then to apply it, right? To apply
Absolutely.
it. to their life, because that's where, like you said, I think you said the word magic. That's where the magic happens, and that's where we really get to make significant contribution and really get the teaching and the lesson from all of it. So in closing, my friend, anything else you want to add in? Any other pearl of wisdom or a final tip?
Yeah, there's one comes to mind. Something really interesting to observe, because whenever we experience the forms of suffering, one of the trickiest parts about it is that it always feels justified, right? We always have our reasons, and it's like, I'm feeling irritated, and then you say, okay, well, let's return to peace, but then you're like, but wait, let me tell you my story first. Let me tell you why, and then you'll understand why I'm angry, or upset, or whatever, or fearful, or whatever. But that's part of the interesting part of the path, is when you can recognize that if peace is your primary, because you also recognize that your internal reality greatly influences your external, then there is no suffering that is truly justified through logic, through intellect, through making somebody else wrong. Even if it all, logically speaking, makes sense, that's where so much of this can become freeing, is when you're really, really willing to prioritize your inner conscious state of peace and acceptance and love and forgiveness over that feeling of the suffering being valid, being real.
I love it. So well said. Thank you for your deep sharing, for being a enlightening, peaceful, wise, loving, inspiring being on the planet right now, and for being on this podcast. I am so grateful to not only listen to your words, but also to be in your energy. It's been a real gift. And I would love for you to share, if you'd like, with the listeners, if anybody wants to reach out to you personally, how would you like them to contact you?
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It was beautiful. So if I do one-on-one sessions, if you're interested in working on a personal level, and I also do, I make lots of videos. I put lots of videos out there and try to involve myself as much as I can, just spreading these things that have dramatically increased the quality of my own life. And both of those are offered on Facebook on my coaching page, Ryan Ostheimer Coaching. Luckily my last name is pretty uncommon, so you type in Ryan Ostheimer, I'll probably be the first one to pop up. And so you can follow the coaching page there and keep up with all the various things that I do if you are interested.
Excellent. And I'm going to spell Ryan's name, and I'll also put it in the podcast notes. It's Ryan, last name Ostheimer, Astheimer. So reach out to him, connect, share these resources. Let's go.
Amen.
If you find this podcast helpful, and if it provokes you in any way, meaning you love what I have to say, or maybe you don't like it because it triggers you, awesome. I've moved something in you, and perhaps you will want to share this with someone else in your life who might be interested in being moved. So you can find us on Apple, on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts. And as always, feel free to share links with people you love, because remember, we are in relationship with each other. So the more that you are present and you invite other people on the journey, the more peaceful world we will live in, because we will be together understanding these concepts. So I thank you for your support, and you help us keep the show going by sharing it, by liking it, by giving us reviews, and helping us to grow. Thank you.